So millions of Zimbabweans face hardship as it comes close to what some see as a meltdown, with worsening drought, water shortages and daily power cuts. Rising inflation has hit those already struggling with food, fuel and medicine shortages more than 18 months after military coup that removed former President Robert Mugabe from power. The new government is struggling to overcome the legacy of his tenure and has failed to live up to expectations, though. That's the analysis by some. Dr. David Monyae, Director, Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, joins me now in the studio to talk a little bit more about this. John Robertson is on the line from Harare in Zimbabwe. A very good evening to you both.
Good evening.
All right, so let's start with you, Dr. Monyae. I'm just curious, what is your point of view? There's those who say, well, there's been a relative improvement in growth since 2018, fiscal deficit has lessened. Is Zimbabwe in crisis or facing a meltdown?
It is a country in crisis, no doubt about it. I think the crisis emanates from the lack of unity within political parties in Zimbabwe and Zimbabweans in general. It's a political in nature, economic, and humanitarian as it now gets much more deeper. And it requires, first and foremost, Zimbabweans' political parties to agree. The strategy I think they've been having since 2001 has been to, opposition wants to pin down the government and win elections, while the governing party also wants to reduce the opposition party to a level of no player within the political landscape. And this strategy hasn't worked, and they tend to repeat the very same strategy after each and every elections. And those who have been there, I remember quite well, we observed the elections in 2001. And the kids who were born in that year are now going to university or colleges. That's how deep the crisis. It has been going for too long. It requires Zimbabweans to overcome the egos at the level of politics, as well as all role players, churches, ordinary Zimbabweans inside the country and outside, to unite and have a period of stabilizing politics and economy, and to get the country out of the crisis. At the same time, the humanitarian level, it requires the region to be prepared to have contingent plans to ensure that there's enough food and deal with issues of medicines and other issues that of humanitarian nature.
So those who say that Zimbabwe cannot escape the legacy of former President Robert Mugabe's macroeconomic policies, is that an accurate statement? Is that fair comment?
Not at all. I mean, it's a question of all of the above. I mean, there's been corruption, there's been disaster in terms of managing the economy from, say, 1990s, and coupled with economic structural adjustment, instability at a political level. So there are a number of factors that brought Zimbabwe where it is. But I think at the end of the day, it is the leadership, the political leadership, that is answerable, that has to take measures to ensure that they have an economy that performs, create employment and ease poverty. But they haven't been doing so, and that in itself becomes the same problem. Zambia is confronted with a similar kind of crisis, but I mean, they've managed to have enough food. They have managed to stabilize quite a number of other areas of which Zimbabwe is failing.
So we'll look at the various measures taken by government to try and harness all of these efforts to rein in the economy. But are we saying basically without political reform there can be no success of turning around the economy?
There has been economic and political reforms, minimum as they can be seen. They have a Vision 2030 that really spells out all what needs to be done. If they could only implement that. But unfortunately, not all political parties buy into it. That's where the problem. It's a question of legitimacy, where the opposition refuses to accept the legitimacy of President Mnangagwa. On the other hand, they are arguing that they need power sharing. And I mean, there's been an attempt to bring all political parties, churches to negotiate, but the modalities have quite an issue in which the government wants to run the entire show. I think the MDC is right to say there's a need to have an independent mediator, whether from the region or the UN level, and to try to ease it. And therefore, at the end of the day,
but there's also been a lot of fighting over that interpretation of who is independent, who actually would qualify as a neutral to mediate between the two parties.
I think the situation in our region is quite clear, that SADC is the custodian of most of what's happening in most of our countries. And therefore, I think one would expect Zimbabweans to at least start knocking at SADC level, even though they criticize the region whenever it endorses elections or bring the parties together. The real answer, I think it should come from the Zimbabweans, not the region.
So let's look at the efforts made by government thus far. The central bank has raised interest rates by like 50% to try and protect the local currency, but then there's also been an increase in tariffs for electricity or for fuel, and now those are envisioned for electricity. And Zimbabweans were already feeling the pressure of saying this can only make the situation worse. And we know some have said it's only going to get worse before it gets better. What is your point of view about the efforts already underway?
I think there's a crisis and a contradiction. I think there's a saying that, a leading saying within that, saying that Zimbabwe is leading in austerity for development, but there's no such a thing, that you can have austerity at the same time and development. However, that's the quagmire that they are in. They have to pay the debt. I think IMF, World Bank wants to come in and normalize the situation. And as we know, IMF and World Bank would want to see austerity as the key to arrest over expenditure in government over expenditure, and a number of other issues that has been affecting the economy. There is a need for Zimbabweans to concentrate on key areas and sectors, particularly agriculture, and ensure that you really beef that up, and also start in terms of infrastructure development. But at the end of the day, I think you need the international community to step in, particularly Western countries, in terms of forgiving Zimbabwe in terms of its debt, as well as deal with the original sin, the land issue.
And speaking of agriculture, there already have been transfers, though, to the agricultural sector. So is that a step in the right direction?
Indeed. I think they're increasing our investments in energy, something that is more promising. Quite a number of measures that the government is taking, which is more promising. But unfortunately, the crisis was so deep that one could not expect answers and positive results in a short term. It will take time, and along the way, a lot of people are going to suffer. So
restrictions in land tenure and investment regulations have been seen as being a source of the problem. What, given the greater macroeconomic policy vision, would work at this point in time?
I think you need a government intervention at this stage. It's a shrinking economy. The government needs to really do the best it can in dealing with food security, dealing with issues of health, basic issues. At the same time, stabilize the issues of currency, I think, at that level. And there has been going forth and back, no clear plan. I think if they could stick to one currency, the Zimbabwean dollar, if they can bring it back and really run with it, I think attempts are being made, but it will really take time for it to work.
But there are those who are completely against that, saying that it has failed time and time again. And as you say, there's much greater certainty needed in that foreign exchange policy. The private sector is saying it has only hurt them and consumers in Zimbabwe.
They have other options. They can use the rand, and that requires negotiation with South Africa and agree to certain terms.
Why is that not on the table, do you think?
It should be. That's the most sensible and that's the most viable currency in the region. I think there is a need to do that. Quite a number of other countries in the region do use the rand. So it really depends with the Zimbabweans. What exactly do they want and what autonomy can they have?
What has been preventing the Zimbabwean government? Because this has been raised time and time again. Lots of Zimbabweans who say they work in South Africa, when they go home, at least they know they get better value for money in terms of the cost of goods and services with the rand. Why is there resistance?
I think the reason given by Zimbabweans that I've come across was that the terms given by the South African Reserve Bank were a bit tight and they didn't agree with it. And that's the main issue. It's a question of sovereignty. But under these circumstances, I think there is a need to have a currency that is at least respectable for short term, but in the long term, work on your own currency.
You spoke about how just the length of time Zimbabwe has been in economic crisis is such that those who were born at the time are in university, and looking at the population size of those between the ages of 15 and 36, I think it's something like 36%. So there are those who are saying, why not focus on at least suggestions or plans that require limited investment? What would those be if Zimbabwe were to go in that direction?
I think what the government could do is to find ways of employment. I think some are saying it's 95, 98%. You really don't trust the figures that you come across. You have to put the youth in terms of task, in terms of doing something. Even if they earn less amount of money, there is a need to put them in schools and to deal with certain skill development, and there is a need to kickstart something.
Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa, when he was campaigning, worked on a plan to support the informal sector, traders, for instance. Should there be greater investment for that? Because a lot of that population falls within that category.
Indeed, and the so-called informal sector really sustain the economy through and through the crisis. Most of big business, I think it went burst. And I think what is needed going forward is to assist small farmers at a level of subsistence. And with time, I think you can go in terms of big projects, in terms of infrastructure, roads, dams, energy, in those areas. And as well as tourism. Zimbabwe it is a huge tourism sector. I think if you start in those areas, with time, I think you're going to gain confidence, as well as trade among SADC and African, in light of the AU free trade area that has been signed.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Dr. David Monyae is Director, Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg.